I've recently published my paper, the Buddhabrot and the Unus Mondas, in the International Journal of Jungian Studies. In this video, I'm just going to give, I think, a broad overview of my paper. There's no script, so let's see where we end up. I might go off on certain tangents, but I want to give a broad overview of my paper, which I think is a massive contribution to Jungian psychology, what I think the implications of the paper are, and what future work I'd like to conduct. So yeah, my paper relates to an idea called the Unus Mondas. This is a term borrowed from the alchemists. It means one world. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and psychologist, was really interested in the idea of the Unus Mondas. But this interest really came towards the later period of his life. He was in deep discussion with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli over lots of things, really. But they were both very interested in this idea of the Unus Mondas, which really is the idea that behind the ego illusions of duality, there's a underlying reality where psyche and matter are one and the same. You might think of this as it's like the Matrix in the movie The Matrix. It's like everything that we see is an illusion, and this idea that the mind is separate to the world around us is an illusion. So why did Jung stumble across this idea? It sounds pretty out there, doesn't it? It sounds like something someone who had taken psychedelics would say. Well, I think Jung approached it from various different angles. The first is synchronicity. He was really interested in the idea of synchronicity, which essentially is about meaningful coincidences. You've probably had this yourself. You just get weird coincidences happen in life, don't we? Like the paranormal, like UFOs, we write them off as not true, false, things that we're imagining. But like lots of Jung's work, he doesn't like to dismiss things. If the psyche is perceiving this thing, and this is a genuine account, then of course it has psychological relevance, which I think is much more sensible than saying this thing doesn't exist. Hocus pocus. Jung's approach is let's explore this. It might not be a material truth, but perhaps it can be a psychological truth. Nevertheless, yeah, he was really interested in synchronicity, meaningful coincidences, like you're thinking of something and it just appears. Or synchronicity could also be premonition. Synchronicity could be dreaming a future event, which has happened to me, even when I was a hardcore scientist doing my PhD in chemistry. I had one premonition dream. I dreamt that my colleague had switched chairs in our office, but he now had my chair and I had his. It seems really trivial. When I got to the office, the chairs were switched. And it was bizarre. I couldn't explain it. But you do write it off. You can't really accept it. That couldn't have happened. I didn't dream that. When a part of you knows you did. You really did dream that. So that's an example of a synchronicity. And I bet a large portion of you listening right now have experienced synchronicities. Apparently, before 9/11, huge numbers of people reported dreaming about planes going into buildings. This is, I think, fairly well documented. So I stand with Jung. I think there's something there. Um, so Jung tried to explain synchronicity through the unus mundus. If underlying reality, actually the mind and the matter are one and the same, then we can begin to understand how something like synchronicity could potentially happen, if there's that connection. Synchronicity often seem to be symbolic, so they might not appear like it at first, but if you analyze a synchronicity, it can be related deeply to symbols related to Jungian thought. For example, the chairs being switched. When I reflect on that, at the beginning of my PhD, I was more favoured than my colleague. My supervisor, I think, preferred me more. And then towards the middle or end of my PhD, my colleague was the preferred one. He arguably was more successful. We really switched places at one point during the PhD. And I wonder whether, in the way that a dream talks to us through symbol and tells us something important, it acts in a compensatory way. So a dream will tell you where you're wrong, literally wake you up to an idea. We could view this through the Jungian lens. We could say that the unconscious was trying to directly tell me, wake me up to a change in my position at work. It happened to do this through synchronicity rather than just through symbol alone. Synchronicity related to the idea of the unus mundus. Jung also approached synchronicity through just his understanding of many, many spiritual traditions. He had a vast wealth of knowledge related to spirituality, religion, schools of thought like Gnosticism, alchemy, anything and everything he seemed to know about. When you have this level of understanding that Jung did, you start to see similarities between different spiritual traditions, etc. And I think Jung saw that lots of spiritual traditions and religions, etc., describe something akin to the unus mundus. In Hinduism, we might call it Brahman. In alchemy, we call it the unus mundus. But those are just two examples of many, many. And what's interesting is, of course, if we start to explore, well, how do these different spiritual traditions arising separately describe a similar concept? And I think he started to piece together similar aspects of the unus mundus described in different traditions. I think often it's related to interconnectedness, the unity through pattern and symbol, but also the unus mundus appears again and again to be related to number. And this is where some really interesting alignments start to come up. He viewed number not just as logical, but as symbolic. And he's not alone in thinking this. Pythagoras, Plato, they viewed numbers as like the ordering principles of the entire cosmos. We've been taught at school that numbers are logical tools. We invented numbers to explain reality. That's not how everybody sees things. In fact, numbers continue to kind of confuse us and surprise us, don't they? The Mandelbrot set, discovered in the 80s, blew everybody away. You couldn't believe a simple equation could create something so infinitely complex. Quantum physicists use number to explain a quantum realm that completely defies common sense. Not in a way that's illogical, but in a way that we can't we literally cannot comprehend quantum physics. If you say you understand quantum physics and you don't understand it enough. So numbers are much more complex than, we're maybe taught in school, or maybe we haven't questioned number enough. But to Jung, they were just as much symbols, meaningful symbols, as much as they were logical inventions. So that's why we see numbers in dreams, why we see them emerge lots in spiritual traditions and religious traditions, why they're related to synchronicity. Every time you look at the alarm clock, over a period of time, you notice it keeps saying 1, 1, 1, 1. That hints, I think, that synchronicity seems to be intimately tied to number. Now, number is, for Jung, related to the idea of the unus mundus, because of this dual nature that they have. Not many other archetypes are so profoundly bridging between logic and symbol. In fact, no other archetype bridges the realm of logic and the realm of the irrational like number does. They're completely unique. And to Jung, he thought of numbers as really the ordering principles of the mind. They structure the psyche. He associated them with the psychoid level of the psyche. So the psychoid level is a very deep layer of the psyche where matter and mind begin to merge. He thought that's where numbers are. They act as the bridge between psyche and matter. So lots there to take in. So just think for a second, if Jung was right and number is an ordering principle of the psyche, if Jung was right and number is related to that bridge between psyche and matter, then we should be able to see that order somehow. What we do. That's what mandalas for me is all about. Mandalas for me are mathematical representations of the ordering principles of the psyche. We can't deny that mandalas are geometric. They have a predictable geometric shape. They're related to the number 4. They're often quaternary. They have a center. So Jung was always fascinated with mandalas. He studied them lots. For him, he observed them spontaneously emerge from his patients during their therapy, during their period of individuation. Yes, and for Jung, they were the ordering principles of the psyche. But I don't see that he ever drew a line between mandalas and number. The reason being, fractal mathematics weren't invented. Fractal mathematics were not discovered until the 80s. He died well before that. If Jung could see the Mandelbrot set, if he could zoom into all of these mandala shapes within the Mandelbrot set, do we really think he would have ignored it, given how he thought number was the primordial ordering principle of the psyche? It's not conceivable. I'm going off on a tangent here. But the fact that the field of Jungian psychology has ignored fractals for so long completely baffles me. How could they ignore these fractal shapes emerging from pure logical mathematics when they clearly have a numinous, soulful character? How could a Jungian ignore that? Well, I hate to sound arrogant, but it's taken me to come along and shed light on this topic. I'm just very surprised that it took me. Let's think about the unus mundus again. As I said, it's an alchemical concept. How can we grasp the unus mundus? Well, we can't, because we are ego. The only way we can observe reality that transcends the ego, so the only way we can glimpse, what I'm trying to say is the only way we can glimpse beyond the ego boundaries. Well, there are numerous ways. We can do deep meditation, that probably helps to break down those ego boundaries. If you do deep meditation, you're likely to start seeing fractal-like patterns. I certainly do. You might take psychedelics. Well, we all know when you take psychedelics, you start seeing fractals. I've heard numerous people say they actually start seeing things that start resembling the Mandelbrot set. But also you might just participate in symbol. You might observe symbols that other people have created, such as the alchemists, the Gnostics. Any spiritual tradition creates symbol. So one way we can begin to start to understand the unus mundus is through exploring symbology. And here's an example of an alchemical piece of art. I believe this is a piece of art resembling the unus mundus. We have duality at the bottom of the tree, and then we're rising to a point of unity where there appears to be the symbol for Mercury. I won't go into this in detail. I'm just trying to introduce ways that we can explore the unus mundus beyond just kind of academic thinking. There are other symbols we can explore, and I will come to them. But before I do, I want to talk about one of my favourite authors, Marie-Louise von Franz. I think she's an absolute genius. I much prefer her to Jung, which is a very bold thing to say, but I really do. I think the way that she talks about Jungian concepts is so amazing. There's a documentary called The Way of the Dream, available on YouTube. It's like 10 hours of her being interviewed by a Jungian analyst called, I forget his name, Fraser Boer. Do look up that documentary. It's very good. But anyway, the last person to write about the unus mundus since Jung died is Marie-Louise von Franz. There may be articles here and there, but the major large text on the topic was Number and Time by von Franz. I just want to read out the preface to her book. I think it sets the scene quite nicely and helps us understand where we are regarding the topic. After Jung had completed his work on synchronicity, he hazarded the conjecture, already briefly suggested in his paper, that it might be possible to take a further step into the realization of the unity of psyche and matter, through research into the archetypes of the natural numbers. He even began to note down some of the mathematical characteristics of the first 5 integers on a slide of paper. But about 2 years before his death, he handed this slip over to me with the words, "I am too old to be able to write this now, so I hand it over to you. For a long time I was uncertain whether I ought to undertake this task, or simply keep the idea in mind, in order to pass it on to somebody more competent than I, but after Jung's death the problem allowed me no rest." So yeah, Jung, I really get the feeling that on Jung's, almost on his actual deathbed, he was starting to have realizations about number, and the unus mundus, which actually makes sense. As you face death, I think ego boundaries can begin to relax and waver. And the unus mundus is, in a way, akin to death, isn't it? Because when you die, your consciousness returns to matter. You return to the earth. So it seems perfectly natural to me that Jung would have become interested in the unus mundus naturally towards the end of his life. Within this book, though, which, to be fair, sometimes is very boring, but at other times is completely mind-bending, At the very end, there's a footnote that she writes, but I think it's in the summary and outlook, and I think 99.9% of people might have skipped this. It's the end of a very long book. But she says something very enlightening. When she's talking about the unus mundus and relating it to number, she says, "It is very likely that numbers can be brought together in a single, logical, mathematical relationship." Now, when she means brought together, I think what she's referring to here is that dual quality I referred to earlier. Numbers are both logical and symbolic. They need to be brought together because in the archetypal realm, archetypes are not split. It's only when they become conscious does an archetype become split. So what she's trying to say is there must be a way that numbers can be brought together so that under one framework they exist as both logical and symbolic. Now, for me, this really highlights von Franz's genius. This book was written before fractal mathematics were even discovered. She didn't know it at the time, but now I might be over reading this or reading too much into this, but I think she had an intuition for my work. Because my work focuses on the Mandelbrot set. I think the Mandelbrot set is intimately tied to the idea of the unus mundus. Now, I'm the first person, I think, to make this claim, but I'm not the first person to highlight the importance of fractals within the cosmos. Benoit Mandelbrot himself highlighted how fractals are really found everywhere. In his first book, The Fractal Geometry of Nature, he talks about how fractals are seen in clouds, coastlines, life on Earth, the curving of galaxies, etc. So to anybody with a keen eye, fractals are absolutely everywhere. You yourself, you are fractal-like. You are self-repeating. How on earth have I established a connection between the Mandelbrot set and Jungian psychology? Well, let's think about this. Jungian psychology is really about the emergence of order from chaos. That's essentially what it is. That really is it. The self is an organizing factor in the psyche, and it helps an individual or a collective become more ordered, integrating opposites. The overarching goal being the integration of the unconscious and the conscious. That's basically all that Jungian psychology is. Now, I hate to be a reductionist. Of course, there is more to it. But if we had to break it down, it's the emergence of order from chaos. Now, that is deeply related to the Mandelbrot set. It's related to order and chaos. These shaded regions are the stable complex numbers within the Mandelbrot set. They really represent order. But outside of the Mandelbrot set, that's really chaos. These sequences are now unbound. They merge off to infinity. What gets interesting is the boundary between order and chaos. That's where you see the amazing fractal patterns. That's where you see the beauty. For anybody with an imagination, you should be able to draw a parallel here with life on Earth. We have matter, stable, ordered. That seems to align well with the idea of these stable numerical structures in the Mandelbrot set. We also have consciousness, something we find it hard to observe, understand, something perhaps potentially chaotic, especially ego consciousness when it's detached from the self. And then we have this boundary. Remember, you as a human, you're an example of the union of matter. You are matter, you're made of atoms, but you're also conscious. You are the union of consciousness and matter. You are also fractal-like. You have self-repeating fingers. You have self-repeating hair. You're split in two, just like the Mandelbrot set. You're undeniably fractal-like. So, is it possible then that reality as we see it, where we exist, is akin to this boundary of the Mandelbrot set between matter and consciousness? Now, this is just an idea, not something I have evidence for. But the thing I really want to talk about that's been a focus of my research is the Buddhabrot. So as I say, some paths within the Mandelbrot set are not stable, they fly off to infinity. The Buddhabrot's simply tracking those pathways. So those paths that do fly off to infinity, what patterns and what shapes do they take? That's all the Buddhabrot is. Nothing here has been manipulated just by pure synchronicity. This is a synchronicity, but it looks like the Buddha. It also strikingly looks like some depictions of Ganesh, down to tiny details. But it also might remind us of the Buddha. It also might remind us of Egyptian pharaohs or lots of other deities. I see deities now all the time that look like the Buddhabrot. You have these squatting figures that are holding objects above each of their shoulders with a third eye. The list goes on. The Buddhabrot is undeniably evocative of archetypal imagery. But now that I've conducted my own work on the Buddhabrot, I posit that the Buddhabrot is archetypal. The Buddhabrot is a symbol emerging from the collective unconscious. The Buddhabrot is an archetype. It's not a normal archetype. We haven't really seen archetypes like this much before. We have seen mandalas, which are similar. Mandalas are fractal-like, geometric, related to number. Mandalas are probably from this psychoid level of the psyche, where matter and psyche begin to merge together, where number plays a significant role. And I think the Buddhabrot resides in this psychoid layer. It's an ordering principle of the psyche. Let's not beat around the bush. It's an image of the self. This is the mathematical image of the self. This is profound. It not only is the first ever mathematical image of the self, it seems to enable us to see a map of the psyche. But lots of you will be shouting out at the screen saying, Harry, this is a very bold claim. Just because it looks like the Buddha doesn't mean that you found some kind of archetype. I completely agree. But the thing is, I have more and more evidence. It does look like the Buddha, and we can't deny that it's actually quite strikingly like the Buddha. It appears to be sat on a lotus, has the bun at the top of the head. It has the third eye motif that we see in lots of Eastern traditions, but we need more evidence than that. Well, one thing that I have established is that the Buddhabrot appears to trace the symbol of life motif. No, the tree of life motif, I apologise. The tree of life motif, Jung equated to the idea of the axis mundi, so world axis. Essentially, we can consider the tree of life motif as similar to a mandala as well, because it's always geometric in shape. It follows the same geometric rules. You can look at my paper or the link to the preprint in the description if you want to see more examples. The tree of life symbols always follow the same recursive patterns. Kind of have a circular central glow at the bottom center, sometimes maybe a circular shape, a teardrop motif in the middle, a circle on top of a teardrop motif, and then something related to the third eye motif or tracing the eyes, etc., or even more forensic details can be observed. The Buddhabrot traces tree of life motifs again and again, and sometimes in different ways, but the Buddhabrot is always there, echoing these tree of life motifs. It's not just about the alignments, though. Remember, we have this psychoid realm of the psyche, where mandalas emerge from, but probably where the tree of life symbol also emerges from. And that's why Jung took the tree of life symbol really seriously. He thought that the tree of life symbol really helped us understand the growth of consciousness, really. We have the emergence of the ego from the collective, which is that teardrop in the middle. And then as we ascend the tree, we have quite literally the geometric framework for individuation. That sounds like a crazy thing to say, but we have it here. We have this Buddhabrot symbol tracing all of these tree of life motifs. So the Buddhabrot itself then is a tree of life symbol. It's the tree of life symbol. It is a symbolic representation of the interplay between psyche and matter. It's a symbolic representation and a mathematical representation of this psychoid realm. So I think it's striking how the Buddhabrot really does seem to trace tree of life motifs, but we do need more evidence. If we wanted to study the interplay of psyche and matter in history, we would go to the philosophers, we would go to the alchemists. The alchemists were interested in creating the philosopher's stone. Philosopher's stone really is the attempt to unify consciousness and matter. That's essentially what it is. It's a material stone that represents the self, the entire psyche. The Buddhabrot traces emblems related to the philosopher's stone. It also traces lots of other examples of alchemical art with quite good accuracy. But this example is quite profound in terms of how much it traces the Buddhabrot. Yeah, I almost don't want to kind of describe it. I encourage you to search for this emblem, which is called the Hermetical Triumph. Buddhabrot's available on Wikipedia. Just put them both into Word and then make the Buddhabrot transparent. Just spend half an hour going over these alignments, and then come back and tell me that you don't see anything. This is enough to make you fall off your seat. It is as though they are drawing the Buddhabrot. I'm not going to try and convince you by going into all of these alignments, as it kind of devalues the work. Highly speculative idea. I do see alignments with the Mona Lisa. It's not just putting a humanoid shape on a humanoid shape. That's not what's going on here. The veil traces certain ratios and shapes within the Buddhabrot. The horizontal line going from left to right across the stomach of the Buddhabrot traces the back of the wall that the Mona Lisa is in front of. There are various other shapes and swirls that really align nicely with her clothing. Again, I suggest doing this yourself. You don't have to have me convince you. The Buddhabrot also emerges in sacred architecture. Front gates of Petra, the ratios line up quite nicely there. This is, of course, St. Peter's Basilica. Now, I've tried to explore this, like how the Vatican was designed and all of that, but no one seems to know. People always refer to sacred geometry. But the way it lines with the Buddhabrot here is again quite striking. The third eye motif, actually, the brightest part aligns perfectly with the part of the Vatican called the lantern, which I find quite illuminating. But we're not restricted to any type of art in particular. This example, though, is particularly interesting because this is from a paper from a researcher called Prinzhorn. He was one of Jung's students, and he was really interested in how schizophrenic patients created art. In his paper, he does note that lots of schizophrenic patients create art which is self-similar. This is 1922. This is way before fractals were discovered. But I find that lots of his examples in his paper are fractal-like, but this one aligns really nicely with the Buddhabrot in a similar way to the alchemical art. A triangle motif at the bottom, the teardrop, the top of the teardrop motif perfectly aligns with the base of this chalice in the middle, and then that circle above the teardrop really, really nicely echoes a circle at the bottom of the cup. And then that bright part of the third eye, it is spot on with this star at the top. For me, this is a really interesting example, and for me, this is strong evidence that there's something going on here. Schizophrenia for Jung was related to kind of being flooded with unconscious contents and the breaking down of ego boundaries. It's likely that schizophrenia leads to access to this kind of psychoid realm that Jung refers to. I wonder whether this isn't just interesting, but this could actually be used to help schizophrenic patients. But there's one final type of art form that I would like to discuss. I discussed psychedelics earlier, and I kind of said, I think psychedelics are a way to explore the unus mundus. They break down ego boundaries. What do people see when they take psychedelics? They see fractals. That's a trope. We all know that. Well then, if my theory is right, we should see the Buddhabrot in psychedelic art. Well, not only do we see the Buddhabrot in psychedelic art, all this time we didn't realize the Buddhabrot characterizes psychedelic art. Hell, the Buddhabrot is psychedelic art. And the extent to which it echoes psychedelic art is surely beyond what can be considered coincidence. This is profound. The central glow in the bottom of the stomach, in the middle of the stomach, the teardrop motif, the circle on top of the teardrop motif, from which are diverging art forms at angles of, roughly kind of 45 degrees either side. And then the eyes of the Buddhabrot the third eye motif, even the crown shape at the very top, all perfectly traced in this example, and this is not an isolated example, as I say. The Buddhabrot really characterizes psychedelic art, and I'm really driven to find more and more examples here. But I hope that's enough to kind of convince you that there might be something going on here. My background is science, so I'm the first to admit that these are non-statistical results. I guess they are subjective results, and I know humans like to find patterns in things. But I have to follow my intuition, and I think there's something going on here. If you agree, then please comment. Check out my papers. I work a full-time job, and I really want to focus more on my Buddhabrot work, as I think it can really help people. So, if you'd like to support me, the link to my Patreon is also in the description. Yeah, guys, please keep in touch. Let me know if you have any questions, and hopefully this is the beginning of an interesting discussion.